a real pleasure to welcome Aaron Goder, who, as we were just discussing, is an alum, I guess, of UKCCSRC in his PhD days. He then went to work for the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, and he's been now with the CCC, the Committee on Climate Change, where he's the industry lead. And I know he must have had a very active, despite being not in the office, but it must have been quite a feat to pull together the sixth carbon budget virtually over these last few months. So for anybody who hasn't seen it, it was released, I guess, about a month ago or so now, and well worth looking at. But the floor is yours, Aaron. Glad you could join us.
Thanks very much, David, for the intro. And yeah, it's, well, like we were kind of chatting about before, it's yes, it's a shame we can't see you all in person. Certainly used to enjoy going along to a UKCCSRC event in the past. But yeah, so we're going to take you through yeah, the CCC's sixth carbon budget advice, and in particular with a particular focus on the CCS aspects of that. It was published on it was the 9th of December. It doesn't feel like it could have been that long ago, because I think might still be in recovery, but anyway, yeah, it's been a little while. So this is what I'm planning to take you through. So yeah, just to start with the big picture, really. We dive straight into the CCS side of things. Hope there's some value in seeing that. If you haven't already, if you have already seen it, then you can consider it a refresher. But I'll take you briefly through how we sort of approach the sixth carbon budget, and then stepping through the different aspects on CCS, so kind of pathways across the economy, a bit of a dive into the different sectors that we looked at CCS for, and then the policy recommendations at the end. So I'll jump in. So this is I'll start with our overall pathway. And so yes, I didn't realize everyone was listening here, but you've seen the sneak preview of the animation. But yeah, so this chart sets out our overall recommended path for emissions towards the net zero goal in 2050, as indicated by the dotted line here. And we're calling that pathway the balanced net zero pathway. You'll hear me refer to that quite a few times. It's probably worth remembering the balanced pathways are sort of our recommended pathway towards net zero. And the columns in this chart are the carbon budgets, and I mean the sort of title of this was the sixth carbon budget. So in the orange column, that is the sixth carbon budget, the allowance of emissions for that period. So I guess to highlight sorry, I can just hear a couple of background noise there. So two key points on this pathway, and our two key recommendations. Well, firstly, on the level of the UK's NDC in 2030. So that's the level of emissions that we're recommending the UK reach, or emissions reduction in 2030. That's a 68% reduction from 1990 levels, and that NDC was to be submitted to the international UN process, and indeed the government accepted the recommendation almost straight away, and submitted that into the international process, so that's now sort of fully accepted. And then our second recommendation as part of this advice was on the emissions level in 2035, and we recommended a 78% reduction in emissions from 1990 levels by 2035. And in terms of sort of the next steps with that, we've made that recommendation. We're expecting the government to sort of look at our recommendation, go through our advice, and legislate on a sixth carbon budget level this year, and of course hopefully at that level. I guess one way to put that 78% reduction in context is that only 2 years ago, our long-term target for 2050 was an 80% reduction. So in fact, we've pretty much brought that forward by 15 years. So it really shows what net zero has meant. It has really increased ambition. So I wanted to say a little bit about what this means in terms of the UK's contribution to global climate change efforts. We see the emissions pathways, but I think this is almost a bit more about what does that translate into in terms of the international picture. So this chart shows per person emissions. And the black line here is the global average, which you can see has been pretty flat, global average per person emissions since 1990. And then the red and green lines show what is required globally to meet either 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. So the red line is to meet 2 degrees and the green line to meet 1.5 degrees. So if we now look at the UK path, so where we've been coming down this blue line here, and then our recommended path, again the balanced pathway, this purple line here. So if we look at this, it starts by sort of tracking the 2 degrees pathway, but then drops down and drops below the 1.5 degrees pathway. And overall, the overall emissions in that period between 2020 and 2050 are roughly equivalent to meeting the pathway for achieving a 50% chance of meeting 1.5 degrees. Or that's the average pathway. So it gives an idea of where this pitches in terms of our contribution to global efforts. So that was the high level balanced pathway. I'd like to take you through just a little bit about how we built this, but I won't dwell on this too much, but just to give you a little context. So it's very much a bottom-up approach. We looked at all of the different sectors of the economy. So this chart is showing the emissions profile for lots of different sectors of the economy, all of them. So from aviation to buildings to transport and agriculture. And they're not all the same. There's differing pace of decarbonisation in different areas of the economy. So very much a bottom-up approach. And then the second point I wanted to make is about uncertainty. So in terms of the advice that we are required to provide on the 6th carbon budget, ultimately needed to be a single number on the amount of emissions or the emissions budget for the period from 2033 to 2037. However, we know we all know there's lots of uncertainty about the future. And so we took an approach to deal with this that involved exploring different possible scenarios. And this involved setting out these 4 exploratory scenarios that you can see here, which represent worlds with different levels of success on behaviour change. That's on the sort of left-hand axis here, and then on innovation along the bottom axis here. And with these different scenarios, the purpose isn't to say we can choose from these, it's to reflect uncertainty about factors that are external to government. So I guess we're saying from sort of government perspective. So on innovation, it might be that we see a world where renewable electricity prices drop far more than we expect. Now, clearly, for both of these axes, there are things that the government can do to help innovation and to help behaviour change, but there's also just uncertainty about where we'll get to. So we set out these different scenarios of different worlds, and then we use those to help construct the balanced net zero pathway that I've just been showing you. The really key point to this pathway is that it's designed to keep open the options of these other pathways. So in practice, what that means is developing different technologies in the 2020s, so that when we get to a bit further on this pathway, we're able to sort of move into whichever path it turns out is the world that we're in, to make sure that we reach net zero whatever. And I guess the other important aspect of the pathway is that it takes a more balanced mix of assumptions about the future. So that's my what I wanted to say on the approach. But now let me I'll get into the CCS aspects. So this, focusing on the chart here, this chart shows the number of megatons of CO2 captured and stored in our balanced pathway, gradually increasing up to 100 megatons around that in 2050, which is roughly equivalent to 20% of today's annual UK emissions, to give you a scale of that. It's used across different sectors of the economy. You can see here the largest wedge here in our balanced pathway is the black wedge. So that's CCS being applied for the purpose of greenhouse gas removals. Essentially, the largest role for CCS in the pathway here is offsetting those really hard to decarbonise emissions from agriculture and aviation. And there's also a role for decarbonising fossil-based power, fossil-based hydrogen production, oil refining, manufacturing, and waste incineration. So that was the balanced pathway. But I wanted, as I've introduced those different scenarios beforehand, I wanted to say a little bit more about those. So the chart here is showing you firstly the balanced pathway that we've just looked at, but then in turn the four exploratory scenarios. So let me just tell you a little bit about these other worlds. So firstly, headwinds. So in headwinds, there's less behaviour change, and so what that means in practice is less demand side, less demand reduction. So on, for example, aviation, the amount of red meat eaten, there's a less demand reduction, and that means that there's a need for higher amounts of greenhouse gas removals. Lower levels of innovation mean that electricity costs in this scenario are a bit higher. Particular renewable electricity costs are higher. That means we see more blue hydrogen, and also we see more gas CCS. And so this is the scenario where you get the most CCS. Then moving on to widespread engagement, the scenario where we see the least CCS. Now that's kind of partly the reverse of what I've just mentioned on aviation and red meat. There's higher demand reduction, so there's less need for greenhouse gas removals. There's also less gas CCS, and that's a mixture of lower electricity demand, and also because of overall behaviour change, there's more biomass available for power, and so less fossil gas CCS. Moving on to widespread innovation. In this scenario, we see more use of DACs with more innovation and more use of synthetic fuels. There's also a big reduction in electricity and electrolysis costs, which means that we see more green hydrogen rather than blue here. In these scenarios, we also see highest CCS capture rates. And then really the focus of tailwinds is the biggest reductions. And so we see the most removals to help us reach net zero by 2042, in fact, in this scenario. It's taking you through the CCS in different scenarios. We did also, we were asked a bit about what the, could we leave CCS out? I mean, in short, for this audience, the answer is no. But we did explore the sensitivity of how far you could go, and the basis for this was the tailwind scenario. And the tailwind scenario very much is the one where, yeah, everything goes for you, or goes for us. All winds are in our favour. So in this scenario, you reach net zero by 2042. And in fact, by 2050, in the scenario, you can see in the graph on the right here that actually you're actually got you're down sort of minus 100 megatons a year. So you're actually in significant negative territory in terms of emissions by 2050. So the sensitivity that we explored here was, well, if you take out much of the CCS, where do you get to? And the answer is that, well, we think in theory you could reach net zero if you without the removals. You still need some CCS, and there's still CCS in manufacturing and a small amount of refining and energy from waste plants where there was no alternative, and where we still needed it to get to net zero. But we didn't cost this, and you know, I guess we really want to point out this is not a recommended scenario. It's likely the exclusion of CCS would significantly increase cumulative emissions over the period. Clearly, as we mentioned previously, it wouldn't be keeping options open, and it would also increase costs. So we looked at this sensitivity. This very much supports our message that the CCS is essential for achieving net zero at lowest cost in the UK, and that, yeah, the CCS is also important in the global context to ensure that technology is as available as possible. So now I want to say a little bit about the role that CCS plays in the different sectors in a little bit more detail. So firstly, on greenhouse gas removals, that was previously that large black wedge that I showed you. There's a bit more behind that, really. So this chart here shows the amount of abatement from engineered removals. It's almost all CCS, with the exception of a very small wedge of wooden construction. And so in total, there's 58 megatons a year of engineered removals in 2050. That's in addition to greenhouse gas removals from nature-based sinks from UK land, which make up 39 megatons of greenhouse gas removals in 2050. BECCS facilities are removing 22 megatons a year by 2035, and 53 by 2050. So that's the majority of the wedges here. And BECCS, I think a big message here is that this isn't just BECCS power. BECCS covers a mixture of different biomass or biomatter based greenhouse gas removals, both in power, waste to energy, industrial heat, biohydrogen, biojet fuel production, and other biofuel and biomethane facilities. And then there's also 5 megatons a year of direct air capture in there. So then to step through to what's going on in the electricity sector. So this chart, it shows the generation mix in the in the balanced pathway. And CCS here is being captured by the dark orange dispatchable low carbon generation wedge here, along with green hydrogen. So that wedge includes gas CCS, BECCS for power, and also green hydrogen. And so you can see there's a continued continued role in there for dispatchable low carbon generation, supporting what is a system largely based on or largely generating electricity from variable renewables. I think a really significant message here is that unabated gas generation is phased out by 2035, meaning that CCS needs to be applied to any remaining gas generation by then. So then next on to hydrogen. So the chart on the left here shows hydrogen production, and the chart on the right shows hydrogen use. And clearly there's a role for CCS in hydrogen production here, both in terms of the light blue wedge of fossil gas plus CCS, but also the biomass plus CCS green wedge there, and making up a really substantial part of the hydrogen production along that path to 2050. And in terms of where that hydrogen goes on to be used, it's in a variety of different sectors, very much in manufacturing early on, but also in power. So I guess as it's playing a storage role, and then very much in shipping in the form of ammonia. And there are other smaller roles in potentially in buildings, in synthetic aviation fuels, and a small role in transport as well. So next on to the role of CCS in manufacturing. So I guess we're moving into smaller amounts of CCS here, and setting this out in the context of the whole decarbonisation of the manufacturing and construction sectors. So this graph here is of emissions and abatement. So the kind of the black line along the top here is the level of emissions if there's no climate policy or climate measures, and then these different wedges here are reducing emissions down to our balanced pathway, which is along the bottom here. And picking out the CCS wedges, we can see them keep CCS in manufacturing starting from around 2025, particularly in fertilizer production, and then really growing over the 2030s in cement and lime production, ethylene. There's also some in steel here, and some other mineral sources. And that's so I should pop this up as kind of quick summary of the sectors with which CCS is used within manufacturing, and most of that's in place by 2040. Then my final sector is energy from waste, and we've seen a really rapid growth in energy from waste plants recently. Certainly at the core of our recommendations on waste is to increase recycling and the role of the circular economy, but that where there is still residual energy from waste, and that CCS should be applied. And it comes in later in our scenarios as a relatively expensive CCS measure, and also because those sites are relatively dispersed around the UK, a bit more difficult to get at. So that's taken you through where CCS fits in our scenarios in terms of the sectors. For the really eagle-eyed among you, and you might have spotted I didn't have a slide on oil refining, but I think it's the role of CCS and oil refining is pretty much covered by slide 11. If you want to jump back to that, I'd really like to move onto policy. So obviously it's lovely having all of that in our scenarios, and we're done, right? Apart from we're not. We'll need some policy to make that happen. And so in the advice we set out what we think is required to enable many of those actions. I won't cover all policies that I think are required to enable that. There probably is a larger suite of policies that are required that are set out in the report. But I guess I've picked out the most CCS specific ones here. So I'll take you through just a little bit on what we've said here. So clearly, in terms of what's going on now at the moment in terms of policy development, the development of business models to support CCS is very much ongoing in the government. And so our recommendation here is to move as soon as possible on those, to decide and finalise the funding models for CCS infrastructure, gas-fired power CCS and industrial CCS, and get those going. Then on transport and storage infrastructure, we've recommended that there's at least 2 CCS clusters established in the mid-2020s, at least 4 by the late 2020s, and further clusters around 2030. And I think what we've really looked at here is that there are smaller sources, and that likely leads to some form of further cluster. But I think what a cluster is called in the future is open to interpretation. Then by 2030, CCS and low carbon hydrogen should be across 5 industrial clusters, capturing and storing at least 10 megatons of CO2 per year. We have more CCS in our scenarios. We're setting this out as a kind of a minimum level. With our advice as per always, while we have these scenarios and indeed our balanced pathways, we tend to take a relatively technology neutral approach. So it may be possible to reach our carbon budgets with different approaches. We have more than 10 megatons in our pathways in 2030, and we think that's a sensible route. We leave flexibility there, really. Then also on transport and storage infrastructure, we've said that the government should work with the minerals industries to develop a detailed joint plan for CO2 transport from dispersed sites. This is because there's many of these sites scattered across the UK. We know CCS will be needed for some of those, including cement plants. It would likely take a long time to develop those plans, and in order to decarbonise in line with the pathway that we have, action on those would need to start soon. So we think that a plan for CO2 transport is required there. Then on capture readiness, I think this is something that cuts across different areas, really, that government should ensure that new gas plants, bioenergy and waste conversion and cement plants are properly CCS ready as soon as possible, and by 2025 at the latest. So that's on new plants. So then, in terms of the policy recommendations by sector, and these probably map quite closely onto where we were with our pathway. So I'll just highlight the key ones here. So on power, we've said that by 2035, gas-fired power should be fitted with CCS, so there should be no unabated gas-fired power after 2035, and there should be at least 50 terawatt hours of dispatchable and flexible generation deployed by 2035. Then on manufacturing and refining, there should be manufacturing CCS projects operating from 2025, and two specific proposed targets. We've suggested that the government set a target to ensure that all ore-based steel making is near zero emissions by 2035 and that all cement production is near zero emissions by 2040, with clear implications for CCS. And on energy from waste plants, they should start retrofitting CCS from the late 2020s with a 2050 backstop for ensuring that all of those have CCS fitted. Then on hydrogen, I'll dash through these fairly quickly actually. We really think it's important that the government sets out a vision for hydrogen and its balance between electrolytic hydrogen and hydrogen from CCS. There needs to be support for both biomass gasification and sustainable aviation fuels, which might have implications for CCS. And also in terms of the use of hydrogen, and this is a broader hydrogen recommendation really, but where hydrogen is being incentivized, it should be incentivized on a level playing field with other options, such as electrification. So then, finally on greenhouse gas removals, and there's a real need for a support mechanism here. I spoke previously about the business models that are being developed for gas power and for industrial CCS. We don't see that at the moment for greenhouse gas removals. That mechanism we want to see something coming forward here by 2022. This could either be by amending some of the existing or the support mechanisms that are being developed, or to introduce an entirely new support mechanism. Also, to allow this, there needs to be an amendment to the Climate Change Act to allow for removals to be accounted for under the Climate Change Act. So we've recommended that that's changed. And finally, this is an area where we think there's further need for demonstration support. And I'm trying to remember whether there was something in the budget yesterday, but if not, I haven't drawn those two things together yet. So that wraps up on the policy side, and that brings me to the end. So yeah, thanks very much for listening. I hope that was useful, and yeah, really happy to have a chat.
Great, thanks, Aaron. I thought that was brilliant. It was really helpful and informative. As Vic says, please do put your questions in the chat, or you're also welcome to raise your hand if you can do that on Zoom. John Gibbons has his hand raised. John, how can I help?
Hi, Aaron, very nice. Tell me, has the Committee on Climate Change ever been accused of being biased towards carbon capture and storage, since it's in all of your proposals? And what would you say if you were accused?
I haven't ever heard it put in that way before, but I've certainly heard commentators say that we certainly are a sort of supporter of CCS, and that's because I guess in order to get to net zero, it's essential you need some of it. There are emissions in there that you just can't reduce without CCS. Secondly, if you want to get there in the most cost-effective route, then having that option in there reduces costs. And I guess thirdly, you really don't want to be going for, you don't want to be limiting your options in terms of emissions reduction options that you've got. If you take it off the table, you're making emissions reduction an awful lot more difficult. And I mean that links with the cost point really. If you take that option off the table, you're forced into other options, high risk and potentially higher costs.
Sorry, can I just, David, I'm sorry, very quick supplementary. Negative emissions, net negative. You did show some scenarios that had net negative emissions for the UK. Are those starting to be looked at now? Bearing in mind that global
so our
emissions.
tailwinds, the tailwind scenario does indeed go net. It goes net negative by 2050 substantially. So we're largely concentrating on the path to net zero. There's not been a substantial focus on looking at the question of might we go beyond and what role might that have. But yeah, indeed, we tend to look up to 2050, and in the scenario where we go beyond zero, it keeps going down. It doesn't just stop.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? I see Guoping, who has a question about coal and energy security. Guoping, do you want to ask your question? Or?
Yeah, sure. Hi, this is Guoping from University of Western Australia. It's late night here, so I didn't open the camera. I mean, if we are aiming at zooming out the coal-fired power by 2035, how could we assure power security to the whole system? Well, obviously, building a large enough battery is impractical.
And are you referring to both coal and gas, or is this just coal?
Well, just the coal. We are building a bit of gas power plants, but I believe that's not going to be enough for the whole society, right?
I mean, so in terms of coal, we're it looks like we're heading towards it being phased out by 2024, and I mean that's already it's government policy to be phased out by 2025, and they're currently looking at whether to phase out by 2024. And realistically, the level of coal power in the UK really is down. We are still seeing some. I saw in the UK capacity mechanism auctions that recently completed. There's still a little bit coming on there, but I don't think that there's a substantial concern that I mean, I don't lead our power analysis, but yeah, we still have gas plant in there to support near-term security of supply. As gas is phased out, there is still abated gas, so gas with CCS in there, or alternatively hydrogen plants, whether that hydrogen is blue or green hydrogen, and some BECCS plant that all provide flexibility, and of course, in addition to flexibility coming from demand side response and storage and interconnection. So, I mean, it is certainly, this is just my view here. I don't lead our power analysis, but I know this is something that many have looked at in a lot of detail. That, I mean, as we phase out coal, I don't think that's really a substantial challenge. As we phase out gas, there clearly is a challenge there, but we're very confident that can be met with that variety of different flexible low carbon options.
Thank you.
Great, and then there's a question from Morteza on CCS clusters. Do you want to ask that, Morteza?
Hello, Aaron. This is Morteza from London. Thank you very much for your presentation. The question is basically why you're suggesting only 2 clusters in the mid-20 and after that 3 or 4 later on. Why not, when we have the technology now, we could, and the government is putting, I think it's 1.5 1 billion, something like that, budget into it. So why don't we have more cluster now to help the environment at the present time? You know, is considering we have some issues with renewable energy at the moment and the hydrogen, then just wait for the later. Is it based on you don't want to basically remove the chance of more investment in hydrogen and renewable, or what is it based on?
So there's a couple of aspects that feature here. One is just the practicalities of where we are on the ground. I think when we spoke to clusters, in terms of clusters that could actually deploy by 2025, I think there's really only two of them. No, three of them. I'm reasonably confident only 3 can deploy in 2025, or that's kind of where plans are at the moment. But there'll be people here that I'm sure can correct me if that's incorrect. So there's sort of perhaps a question as to 2 or 3 in 2025 at that margin, and we have further clusters deploying in the late 2020s. So I can't remember if that's 2020. I can't remember the year in there, 2027 or 28. I think there's a couple of things going on here. Both there's our assessment of the economics and the costs, a bit of a balance there. There's also a little bit of flexibility there in terms of how government designs its programs there, not to for us to over specify. I mean, so there's quite a lot of I think there's a lot of ambition there. We're not saying definitely don't, but we're saying at least if the government was brought forward support that enabled 3 clusters in 2025, that would be great. I think there is a little bit of flex in here, and also there's just also I think limit in terms of what industry are kind of assessing as possible at the moment. So I think they're the main factors that are within that.
So is it you mentioned is only because of the cost and the possibility you're suggesting is at least 2 or 3 cluster or based on other?
So I think there's industry constraints, costs, and a little bit of optionality in terms of policy design.
Yeah, but if you compare it to hydrogen, for example, it's much cheaper than hydrogen.
I mean, in terms of the amount of, so I think is your question about what we use for power? Is that the question?
Yeah.
I mean,
what I'm saying is, if you're comparing it with the other industry, like for example, developing hydrogen, we need to develop hydrogen anyway. But what I'm saying is, when you say cost for CCS, is still much cheaper than the investment we are doing on hydrogen. So why don't we invest more when we can, than rather than investing on a very, very expensive technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the number of clusters here doesn't completely map onto the amount of gas CCS versus hydrogen-based power. We could have more or less in the number of in different locations. So could there? But I think could there be there is scope for going a little bit, for having a little bit more than we have if there was a desire to move forward with all clusters at maximum pace. There's a balance in here.
Maybe I could just quickly add on. I mean, I think there will be more than 2 clusters that would claim they could be ready by 2025. I mean, the government, I guess, will be deciding in the next few months as to what the 2 kind of priority clusters will be and so on. But more generally, I wonder if you could say, you know, to what extent do you take existing government policy and try and push it a bit further, as opposed to, do you think that on certain areas, oh, well, that's moving too far beyond government policy, and that's, you know, to what extent do you really start with a blank slate versus being cognizant of what the government kind of policies and priorities that the laid out are, and then try to kind of push them or accelerate them? I think of like the EV mandate and so on as an example.
I think what we're really cognizant of in this case is where industry is, and with those. So there seems little point in us trying to get recommend 4 clusters by 2025 when that looks infeasible. We very much underpin this by feasibility. In terms of government policy, it's a great question. What we try not to overprescribe. I think that's the general principle. I don't think we're trying to take the high level requirements of the Act that we're there to try and help with recommending the best way to meet UK climate change targets. But clearly within that, it can be met in different ways. So we won't overprescribe. And so if the government is going down one path and we think, well, actually that'll probably work, it might, there's clearly so in a particular area, there might be 2 or 3 options and the government's chosen one, and there is not a completely hard and fast case to say that definitely isn't the case, then we will generally be of the view that that's good progress, great, keep going. We want to be supportive where there's positive action. So that takes into account, I think, what the government is doing. It's ensuring that we're going in the right direction without over prescribing.
Great. So I'm conscious that we have a bunch of questions that have been building up. So if people could just ask them kind of crisply, and we can maybe get through more. So Sophia T.
Sorry, I said just my daughter's name. I just found out I should change the name.
Oh, okay, very good.
I started to change the name. Because my daughter used that for her class. My name is Jun Wang Tang at UCL. 2 quick questions. I think it's a very nice talk. And one thing is about this. I see lots of people about the CCS CO2 capture from air, and it seems to me, because I'm an engineer, I think that's a very energy intensive process. I'm not sure your opinion if the CCS can work economically to capture CO2 from air, or that's only okay for for exhaust from industry. That's one quick question. And the other thing is about this green hydrogen, because that's a very big picture. It looks beautiful. Hydrogen can be used for heating, for energy, for organic synthesis. If so, and the fossil fuel will be a small portion in the future. Do we need this CCS? Because for the agriculture, for the increase the population needs the food, and the food needs CO2. Do we model how much CO2 in the future we need in 30, 40 years? And think about the increase the population. And in that case, do we need this CCS technology to play a big role?
So I think on the hydrogen front, where it comes to do we need blue hydrogen? I think our view is yes, we need a mix of green and blue. We should be taking them both forwards. Kind of comes back to the optionality point from before. Let's ensure that we have all of those options available. We do think that at the moment blue hydrogen would be cheaper. We expect that as the cost of renewables continues to come down, that green will become increasingly competitive, both as the cost of renewables come down and at the cost of electrolysis comes down. but yeah, deploying both of those, that also enables us to have a very useful transition, and there's lots of societal aspects of that too, about transitions for sort of various workers and sectors across the UK. So there's clear benefits there from ensuring that we have a kind of gradual transition rather than what might involve waiting a bit longer for green hydrogen, or in the meantime, I think it would be, we would assess that it would be quite a bit more expensive in the very near term. So I think it's a balance of those factors, and that means that it really is a more prudent approach to take both forwards. I mean, we're certainly more optimistic about green hydrogen now than we have been, looking at kind of continuing falling costs, and so we see it becoming cheaper at some point in the future, and that's why it plays a role in these scenarios, but it's not at the moment.
Great. So Ugo's next on infrastructure.
Oh yeah, thank you. Just a question about the CCS and hydrogen infrastructure. Can you slide? Okay, sure. At the beginning, you expect reasonably to identify few of the 5 industrial cluster. My question was, if you have been looking towards 2050, if you expect the infrastructure to move inland from the offshore side, especially the hydrogen one, and then there was some study, for example, by Imperial College that suggests that producing hydrogen close to the demand center and probably with some onshore storing should be more cost effective than relying on coastal infrastructure, or if the question is too detailed for the CCC analysis.
Yeah, so I think the question is it's about how do we think the infrastructure developed? Does it start in centres, and how does it sort of grow over time?
Yeah, okay, Skiria, you start at the industrial center. If you expect to move inward or to remain coastal, or if you don't worry about it, okay, it's too detailed. That's the question.
Yeah, I mean it's a great
especially
question.
Hydrogen.
It's a great question. I don't think we pretend to know. I don't think anyone knows the answer for sure. This is one of the things that's captured by our different scenarios. Okay, I can tell you what we looked at in the different scenarios to reflect what we think are the possibilities. So there are very much scenarios where we saw hydrogen starting in clusters, and then actually that's where it doesn't expand much out of those. And the other end is that you do completely convert the networks, and that a slightly larger proportion of buildings end up using hydrogen. We never have, we don't see any scenario where all buildings have hydrogen, but we do have some scenarios where there are a high proportion of buildings using hydrogen. And I guess those are the cases where the largest proportion of the existing grids are converted, and that also allows hydrogen to then be used in dispersed industry. So I think there's I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see what how this side of things developed. We did try to progress this further as work by both cluster projects but also by the network operators develops. I think we'll look into, we'll get a better understanding of this. But I think it's something that we continue to be interested in, what the picture will be. But the recommendation here is get started in clusters. That's a low regret action. So we can proceed on that basis. And that's kind of sufficient for now. And then we should also be developing our plans for the next step. So yeah, that's our position at the moment.
Thank you.
Great. We are running out of time, but Robert Hall has a question on DAC. If he's not there, I mean, his question was why it was so low and kicked in so late.
we are a little bit more cautious on DAC, where the technology is and where the costs are. I think be a fair summary of where we are. So I mean, if that's being driven by a policy that perhaps sits alongside BECS, we would see that we would estimate that BECS would be more competitive, and so that would be why it comes in where there's less and later.
And then Nita has a question on green versus blue.
Well, hi. I think this is also related to that previous question about, you know, if green hydrogen works well, will CCS be necessary? And I really think this, you know, needs to be looked at in greater detail, because you were saying, well, blue hydrogen is cheaper because fossil fuels are cheaper, but you know, you have to have the CCS with it, which, you know, CCS is not cheap. So, and certain, I'm Alberta, Canada, and we're really, there's a big push to look at hydrogen strategy. And also there's a push to look at small modular nuclear reactors. Those are ones less than 300 megawatts in size. And you know, there's these other technology developments occurring that might slow down CCS deployment. So how are you taking all those trends into consideration?
So we've made our best assessment of future cost trajectories and accounting for the potential that costs of renewable electricity and electrolysis can continue their fast decline, and compared that against the costs that we think there are from blue hydrogen, and what we see there is that green at some point becomes cheaper than blue. We're not at that point yet. Indeed, both green hydrogen and blue hydrogen are definitely more expensive than natural gas, if we're excluding any carbon policy. So we can say they're both expensive at the moment. Perhaps there's one day in the future where green hydrogen will be so cheap that it'll be cheaper than natural gas, but at the moment they're both relatively expensive, and where we get to in terms of the numbers is that blue's still cheaper today. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be moving with green, because we think that there's benefits in terms of developing green, both for in terms of UK economic benefits and the long-term picture, but that we should be moving forward both. So it's perhaps interesting in different countries around the world, and there are some countries in the world that have particularly low electricity prices, and that might be maybe a little bit different there, and we expect that to be different in the future. We also have some hydrogen from imports in our scenario that perhaps reflects hydrogen from concentrated solar in the Sahara Desert, then being shipped around, and clearly, if there's where there is very low electricity prices, then green will be more competitive there. But so this is on the basis of where we are in the UK at the moment, and it looks like blue's still cheaper at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Great, so I'm conscious we're just past 3, but maybe if Esin maybe wants to ask her a question, which I think is interesting about global emissions reductions.
Thank you. Esin here from the LSE Grant and Research Institute. That was really interesting. And my question was, to what extent have you considered how the UK could use its own CCS deployment to drive global emissions reductions, for instance, by exporting its storage capacity, and whether that's factored into the recommendations you make domestically? Thanks.
It's a good question, and actually, yeah, we're really aware of this, and it certainly feeds in the background in terms of awareness that there's an economic opportunity with CCS for the UK that can have yeah, benefits in terms of jobs growth, etc. In terms of much of our analysis here, it probably plays a little bit less of a role. We haven't, for example, yeah, within the analysis isn't an assumption about the amount of imported CO2 to be stored. But I would absolutely, yeah, agree. There's definitely potential in the UK to store emissions from other countries. There's no way our scenarios aren't at all inconsistent with that. We could perhaps just add on a couple of sentences on the back. We only got to 997 pages, so we definitely needed 3 more. So I'm sure we could, yeah, add a few lines at the back about using UK storage capacity. Certainly, I think in the past the discussion has often been that in terms of there's lower storage capacity in continental Europe, and the North Sea capacity could play a role for storing any emissions from there. And yeah, I guess we'd be in a kind of competitive market with other stores from, I don't know, yeah, Holland, Norway, UK.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Aaron. I mentioned this at the beginning. If people haven't had a chance to read the 6th Carbon Budget, they should. It actually, as these things go, is quite readable, I think. But thanks very much for joining us. I thought it was a good conversation, and again, I'm speaking for everybody. I think we really appreciate it. Yeah, thanks very much, David. Yeah, and thanks everyone for having me along. And yeah, have a lovely afternoon. Hope we're all out well. Yeah, looking forward to the summer. We all are. Thank you, Aaron.
If anybody is tuning in next week, we've got an expert assessment of greenhouse gas removal option from Diarmaid Cleary in University of East Anglia, and the impacts of heterogeneity on CO2 capillary trapping within the Captain Sandstone from Catherine Harris at Imperial. So I hope that some of you can tune in at the same time next week. But thank you again to Aaron. That was immensely useful to everybody. So thanks for coming. And thank you to David for chairing. A pleasure. Thanks all. Thank you. Thanks all. Thanks, Aaron. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.